Are you ready? It is time for KMB Talk. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of KMB Talk. I am your host, Carey Michael Bennett. Today on the line with us from Captive to Captain, CEO and Chief Consultant at Cultural Forte. What a story we have to tell. Let's go ahead and get her on the line. Everyone, help me welcome Daniella Young. Daniella, how are you?
I'm great, Carey. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, from captive to captain, let's touch on that real quick. You were a captive and escaped from a religious cult at about the age of 15. Is that right?
Yes. So I was born and raised. I was actually a third-generation member of a very crazy modern-day religious cult called the Children of God. And I was born in it. That was all I ever knew. My mom was born in it too. And I escaped that life with some help when I was 15 years old and came to the U.S.
So this was
alone.
Abroad.
It was started in America and then moved abroad over 100 different countries, I believe.
Oh, my goodness. And so then you come to America alone at 15.
Yes.
Wow. So it's,
landed in.
What was that?
Landed in Texas. Showed up ready for my first day of high school at 15 years old.
Oh my gosh! Talk about a first day. I mean, I have a 12-year-old daughter, and starting first day of 7th grade, we thought that was monumental. I cannot imagine what you endured and went through. But then the phrase is from captive to captain. So subsequently, you ended up being a captain in the U.S. Army.
Yes. So after I went through, essentially put myself through high school, put myself through college, obviously with lots of amazing people helping me along the way.
Absolutely.
I remember, Carey, I had this moment of thinking, God, I won the lottery of life because I'm an American citizen and I got to come here. And, I know at that point, I knew a lot of other cult survivors that were like a Mexican citizen or an Indian citizen and did not have that opportunity.
Right.
And I wanted to give something back. And so I learned about the officer program in the Army, said I can go in, do 3 years, get some great training. I was graduating with a degree in English in 2009, so it was a way to not be unemployed.
Right.
And I thought this is a great way for me to give 3 years back to the country that sort of gave me my whole life. And that was how I got started.
Wow. And then subsequently you end up being deployed in one of the first, if not the first, mixed gender combat units.
Yes. So I was deployed. I did 2 tours to Afghanistan, and the first time I went over there was in 2011. And I was in a regular unit, and then I was also sort of tasked out. They essentially said, hey, of all the sort of fit and great, female volunteers, who wants to go out and do this experiment?
Oh.
I call it, because really it was, Congress was still debating on whether sort of women were good enough to be in combat.
Right.
But the reality was, over there fighting terrorists in a Muslim culture, it was all about getting the local people on our side. And in order to do that, we needed to respect Muslim culture.
Right.
Muslim culture says men can't touch women. And so the military was desperate. Like, we need women. We don't have time for the politicians to figure it out. We need women on the ground right now. And it was a super interesting, I think we're going to talk about culture, super interesting experiment in cultural change for the U.S. military.
I mean, we could chop this, what we've spoken about so far, we could chop it into various pieces and really have a whole show on those pieces in and of itself. But let's take it forward-looking. So, explain to me the transition between U.S. Army captain to CEO and chief consultant at Cultural Forte.
Yes. So I left the military. I sort of did what most veterans do and said, what does my job say that I do?
Right.
And I was an intelligence and security officer in the military. We were moving out to Seattle because my husband is still an active duty helicopter pilot.
Okay.
And so I couldn't go to DC and continue to do intelligence. So I got into security, corporate security. So think locked doors, keeping people from stealing stuff, etc.
Right.
and worked for a very large, wonderful corporation, but just realized it was not my jam.
Got you.
And started really looking at what I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. And I kept coming back to this phrase that one of the best leaders I ever worked for said to me when I had shared my cult background with him and sort of the journey that I've been on in my life. And a lot of people used to joke and say, wait, so you left one cult and then you joined another cult, the U.S. Army? And people laugh.
I'm laughing right now.
But what he said to me after he heard my story, he said, oh my God, Daniella, do you know the kinds of insights you must have about leadership and culture and large organizations and how they behave?
Right.
And at the time, I honestly said, no, I don't know. But I really kept thinking about that, kept coming back to that. And like every entrepreneur, I've been on a journey. I realized that I love teaching adults things in innovative ways. And I love when the work experience is a great experience versus a terrible experience. And so I tried to build a team building company. And what I realized is that it's kind of like having the cure for cancer, but nobody knows they have cancer yet.
Oh.
And so a lot of times leaders, very great, very well-meaning, operations-minded business leaders, they don't realize that culture is their problem. They think they have a finance problem. They think they have a recruiting problem. They think they have a talent problem. And they just don't realize that they have a financial strategy for their business, right? But they don't have a culture strategy. And so I found sort of an area where I can come in and essentially applying, military strategy to, I want to get from point A to point B. 3 years from now, I want my culture to look like this with these outcomes.
Right.
And we can apply tools and techniques and also checkpoints along the way in case people get off base.
Right. Well, okay, we're about to dive off into the deep end of the pool when we have a organizational culture discussion, especially as it relates to existing leadership. You're right. In my observations, I've seen the same. I think it's very interesting to me that as having an opportunity to speak with senior leaders of major organizations, not knowing what they're going to say beforehand because the show is unscripted, it seems that the overwhelming bulk of the time, these successful leaders, okay, so they're presently experiencing tremendous success, are very quick to speak to culture and the impact of culture on the organization. And a few have gone so far as to say culture is going to eat in 2018 and 2019, whenever the dialogue was, but recent dialogues, they're very quick to say culture is going to eat strategy every single time. You can have the best strategist in the room. And I'm sitting there going, oh gosh, because that's what I like doing. Am I not useful anymore? The world doesn't need the Carries anymore. They need the Daniellas. But the culture is going to eat strategy every single time. And okay, so as a listener, as an observer, I agree with what they're saying, but then I think that subsequently the sad, not sad, but the challenge, which is therefore the opportunity, is for so many other leaders that are scratching their head. Maybe they're growing, but not at the growth that they want to, or the growth the opportunity that they have before them. Or maybe they're blaming external factors. Oh my gosh, the disruptors are coming in. They don't understand. If you can focus, not solely, but if you can intentionally get, very, very dug into the culture dialogue, the results might startle you that your culture is nowhere near what you think it is.
Yeah, there's so much in what you said, Carrie, that is so true. And I definitely want to get back to your strategist versus culture, because that's really what I'm all about. But I think that, like you said, like in 2014, culture was the word of the year. Since then, it's a huge thing. Everybody knows it. Everyone's heard about it. I don't think you could find a business leader that says, no, culture is not important. But it's what is that strategy? Is there an actual strategy? Have you sat down? Have you written out a 3-year plan? Do you have somebody in your organization who's appointed as being in charge of culture? Just like you have someone in charge of finance or in charge of HR. because I think, to your point, it's every leader wants a great culture, but not everyone knows how to get there.
Right.
So, I was asked just yesterday by somebody was, how do I find the person I need on the ground is someone that's an expert in business and in culture. And I think maybe that even that idea is a fallacy. And coming back to you said, Carrie versus Daniella, strategy versus culture, I think sometimes you need a little bit of a back and forth.
Right.
And I can explain that is that sometimes I think culture and operations seem to have different priorities.
Right.
And, they're starting to do now all of these studies. Harvard Business Review says that culture impacts your profit 756%. There's these numbers behind it, but in the moment, does the decision seem to make sense? Often we go with operations instead of culture.
True.
So if there's somebody in your organization who's maybe not the CEO, it's very, very hard to be an expert on everything. Is there somebody in your organization that's designated to be the person that speaks up about culture?
Right.
And that's, Carrie, you and I are both military. In my role in the military, and probably in your role too, we have, different areas of expertise. And mine was specifically as the operations officer. Not the operations officer, the intelligence officer. The operations officer makes the decision about where they're going and what they're doing. The intelligence officer is strictly there to advise, once you get out the gate, these are all the different things that might try to harm you.
Right.
And the intelligence officer very specifically has no decision-making ability, because as soon as there's any kind of decision-making ability, it starts to influence the recommendations.
Got you.
So either if I have to be worried about the lives of our guys, I might play up the threat. Or if I have to be worried about operation success and this is what the boss wants to achieve, these are the numbers, these are the metrics, then I might play down the threat. And so to keep it a real recommendation, the intelligence has no stake.
Gotcha.
And so their job just to, give the total honest truth to the boss. And I think when we're looking at culture, that can be super helpful to CEOs, is to either identify a person already in their organization who exemplifies their values, or a consultant from the outside.
Right.
And that's the person that every time we make a policy, every time we make a decision, we go and we ask that person, what is the culture threat here?
Well, so listen, I've been through several, I have experience in several businesses that have gone through some type of a transformation. And I've spoken to this before. I can't recall where, but one example that really always comes to mind. So I joked earlier about strategy versus consulting. The funny thing is that I actually do culture strategy work. And what I find interesting about that is that, in my experience, not all organizations are actually prepared to realize the culture that they have in mind, and they need more work than just a singular expert to come in. And let me describe that. So one particular bank was going through a physical transformation of their facilities. And, banks typically have been, they've had the same layout for many, many, many years. And this newer physical layout, sometimes it has a little bit more of a cafe feel to it, like a Wi-Fi coffee shop / in the corner there's a bank. There's varying levels of branch transformation, but essentially in one particular bank, there was one particular teller, and the leader of that bank shared the story with me that going into the physical transformation, and they're looking at the logistics and how is this going to disrupt our customers or our services, during the 6 to 7 weeks. And one thing that really surprised them was they had this one very tenured, outstanding, excellent employee of the month, employee of the year candidate teller they weren't upset. They were highly, highly concerned, because for the better part of 20 years, they've had their space, they had their tissues, they had the family photo in place. It was their area. of every question that this employee could ask and of every concern that they could have about this transformation, they weren't speaking openly, but they could tell something was wrong. But when they dug in, this person was really upset and resistant about being moved to a different part of the bank, the same role, the same job function, but a different part of the bank, where no longer would it be appropriate for them to have their personal items in this space, because it was a universal space. Anyone should be able to come into it and work in it. So less personalized offices and more general purpose space. That, to me, really describes the challenge that a lot of businesses have with, okay, here are your tenured staff. Are they prepared to have the culture that you're wanting to have to really seize the opportunities that are out there before you that require an amazing culture? So there's many aspects of it in my experience and observation. Sometimes it's a matter of, hey, we're ready for a new culture. Come tell us how to do it. Other times there are going to be some battles internally, even at a senior management level. Human nature, right? Why fix it if it isn't broke? And they're just not willing to even understand that it is broke. But when you go into an organization, are you doing an assessment of this? Your culture can't even change yet because you've got X, Y, and Z you need to take care of?
Yes. Well, the first thing I think is to define the culture. So the first thing I do with the business leader and their primary staff is define what their culture is.
Okay.
Right? So it's not like you have a good culture or you don't have a culture. Like, you already have an existing culture, which is exactly what you said, and I heard when you were talking about the people and their family photos, that culture values the individuality and the independence of the employees and the self-drive right now over kind of a more team atmosphere.
Okay.
And they're saying they want to get to a team atmosphere, which is why they're trying to do the joint space, but that's not where the employees are coming from.
Okay.
And I think neither, what's always interesting for business leaders to realize is neither one is good or bad. The first thing you want to do is you want to just get really honest about what your culture is.
Okay.
Because then every policy you have, every decision you make, the way you design your space, literally everything kind of either reinforces that or takes away from that.
Okay.
And that's what I mean when I say tools and tips and checkpoints, right? So you can have the idea, hey, we're going to move this office space because we want it to do this. Then what are your checkpoints along the way to go back and revisit it and say, did it do this, or are we seeing something different? Because, that's the other thing, is you can never predict, right? You can never predict what one policy or one shift is going to do.
Right.
And so it all works together. You have to figure out what your culture is. You have to figure out where you want to get to. It's literally not different from navigating, through the desert with a compass.
Right.
You need to know where you're trying to get to. You need to know why you're trying to get there, what means you're going to take to get there. So we're going to change the space to look like this, because we want to promote teamwork. And then you need to go back and you need to have your checkpoints. And of course, based on the story you told.
You go. I'm sorry. Keep going.
I would say, based on the story you told, I would also recommend checking with your employees before you implement a well-meaning culture change.
That's where I was leading.
That may not be what they want.
Because I'm thinking, if you put me in the desert with a compass and you tell me, Carrie, here's your objective is to get here. I'm getting my azimuth and planning out my route. But fundamentally, everything is 100%. My being successful is 100% dependent upon identifying where I presently am on the map. Without that, everything else is an educated guess at best. Okay. So let me ask you this. And people, listeners, reviewers may disagree with my comment, and that's great. That's fair. But let me ask you your opinion on something. In your opinion, for an organization with more than 50 employees of any industry, do you think that organization can accurately define their culture internally, or should they use a third-party resource?
Oof. So I think, it's interesting that you had the 50 employees,
Let me
because
say why. Let me say why. So I know a CEO who is just a cultural, he's so fantastic, but he has less than 50 employees, excuse me, and time, our resource of time, right? He has access and can have the time to have access to everyone in his organization on a very regular basis. But I also know a CEO just as passionate and just as passionate about culture with hundreds of employees. And at the end of the day, it's not physically possible from a time perspective to him to have that same quality conversation with everyone in his organization on a regular basis. Therefore, I think he would be less able to accurately describe the real culture of the organization versus the CEO of the smaller organization.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things there, and one is that there's team culture and then there's organizational culture, and those are connected but different.
Okay.
So that's one thing, right? That your organization has a certain culture, and then small teams can also have their own internal cultures.
Right.
And then the other thing is, I think that, okay, so then two more things. One is that even if you're trying to accurately diagnose your own culture, you're still looking at it from inside of it.
Okay.
So I do think whether it's bringing in a consultant, whether it's telling your employees to bring, buddies from other organizations in, however you want to do it, I think getting outside perspectives is always helpful.
Gotcha.
And then the third thing that you said, as far as, how involved the CEO can be, I think that's up to the business leader when the organizations get big.
Right.
And that's up to how much of the actual work they're going to do.
Okay.
So to your point, and I listened to your podcast with that business leader of that large company, and I loved what he said, and he's all about it.
Yep. Ed Rossage.
I had a CEO in the military, a boss in the military, who was in charge of 800 people, and we were at war. So he was literally probably, most high stakes, should have been busiest guy ever. His policy was leadership by walking around. We called him the ninja, because you would just turn over and he would be there. And he literally spent less than 20% of his time at his desk.
Yep.
Or flying the helicopter, which were the two things that were technically what you might have thought he should have been doing.
Right.
He was very good at delegating to everyone else. And he spent all of his time, like he would be out there turning wrenches with the mechanics. He would be sitting down with my team, asking them to show him the metrics on the enemy. And doing that, I think he had an amazing pulse on his culture. But it goes kind of back to that expertise. Like, you can't be an expert in everything.
Right.
So he wasn't actually running his own company. His deputies were running it.
Right.
He was running culture and the leadership. And,
yep.
and from my perspective, it was phenomenal.
Well, and every industry is so different.
Can't do that.
Right. And every industry is so different, and the requirements of, and we're using the title CEO. I mean, there's so many important roles within the senior leadership teams of these organizations, but CEO is something we can all relate to. We, familiar with the title, but in these varying industries, the role of the CEO differs greatly. I mean, in some industries, it's very important for the CEO to be publicly, to do a lot of public speaking often, right? A lot of evening events, a lot of weekend events, a lot of civic events and charity events, and they're the face of the organization, and others are in their office in the weeds. But in both cases, I think that the better ones, you said lead by walking around, and I know the phrase manage by walking around, MBWA. But in my observations, I think the best, regardless of industry, really wear out the soles of their shoes more than their peers, because they are constantly in the trenches as often as they can be, if only for a brief moment in time. The result, I'm so sorry, the result on the employee interaction is profound. I mean, even when that employee leaves for the day or at the end of their day, and go home, the way that that employee interacts with their family and their children and their animals, all is affected because of a positive interaction with a senior leader of the organization during that particular day. So you're looking at this exponential benefit of active senior leader communications.
Absolutely. And, another thing I think with leaders, whatever level of leader they're at, that's very effective, to combine with management by walking around, is being very, very explicit to people about how much feedback they want, what kind of feedback they want, and how honest they want it to be.
Right.
Because, we all think, sort of like I mentioned earlier, like nobody's setting out to create a bad culture. As leaders, we all think we're good people, even if we know we can improve.
Right.
And we all sort of want to help people. We don't always know how we're coming across. And so that same leader that I mentioned, he was a very serious guy that had no facial expressions. So he knew that. And so he would tell people, I always look angry. I'm not angry. Please come up to me and talk to me whenever you see me.
Right.
And because he did that, I think people talk to him even more.
Right.
On the other hand, you've met me. I'm a very bubbly, outgoing, small girl. And I had this perception that I came off as super friendly. And yet still, in my role as a captain in the Army, I was told over and over again how scary I was.
Really?
And it wasn't until I learned that I needed to tell people, very actively that I wanted their feedback. Yes, really. I mean, we can go into, women in uniform and how they're perceived and all that. But
right.
I think that for every leader, right, having this, sit-down moment, whether it's with an outside consultant, whether it's asking your spouse to tell you how you come across when you're talking to work people. There's a lot of different ways, different homework assignments I can give leaders.
Right.
But you need to figure out how you come across to your people, because you might think you're very friendly or you're very approachable, and they might not see it that way. So then if you do that, you spend all your time walking around, but they're still not talking to you. So those two things combined, I think, are very important.
That's very interesting, and I think I'm glad that you brought that up. It's something I need to pay more attention to. In my mind, I feel pretty comfortable and confident knowing how someone perceived me during an interaction, and I don't need to be. I need to be a little less complacent in that area and a little bit more inquisitive. Follow-up emails, right? Grade me on our interaction today.
Yep,
but it's true. But it's true. Well, listen, so...
And a very simple message from the CEO, like, look, this is the way that I am. You might not be like this. So if I come across a certain way, you and I are both very outgoing, Carrie, but to shy people, that comes across as very intense.
Right, right.
And so I'm not going to change. They're not going to change. So having that conversation from a business perspective, like, look, I'm always bubbly, I'm always happy. That doesn't mean I can't be serious, right? That might be an important thing for me to do when I come in somewhere.
Well, let's talk about Cultural Forte. So jokes aside, I am not a Fortnite person, but I hear it so often. I don't even know what in the world it is, actually. And it doesn't matter. I don't want to know. But when I was building your show, it occurred to me this morning when I was looking over the materials that instead of putting Forte, I had put Cultural Fortnite. And thank goodness I caught it. So Cultural Forte, FORTE.com. I thought that your website was very useful. As a matter of fact, I thought it was very useful. So I took some time poking around. The information is there. It's very simple to follow the logic behind what you're saying and suggesting, but you went so far as to take it a step further, and I love it when people do this. I need to get better at doing this, but you have a blog, and I was able to read through several of your articles. Great articles. What a wonderful resource for literally anyone who's wanting to positively impact the culture of their organization. So if you are a viewer or listener, I would highly recommend taking some time, poke around culturalforte.com. Also, just go ahead and let you know, you can find Daniella on LinkedIn, Daniella Young, Twitter and Instagram, Daniella M. Young, and Cultural Forte is on LinkedIn as well, right? Perfect. Okay, so I just want to make sure the viewers actually get to see this on the screen. The listeners, the podcast listeners don't. So I want to make sure that everyone understands how to reach out and contact you. Okay, so Cultural Forte. What exactly is what's your high level vision with Cultural Forte?
Yeah, my high level vision is that I can help, come in and help CEOs to intentionally build a culture, not predefine what their culture should be for them, but
Right.
really get in with them, figure out what their both business and sort of personal goals are,
Right.
and help them build that path. High level, of course, for the future, there will be a book, there will be workshops, but really one of the things that I think is so interesting I've heard with, there's all of these leadership writers or culture writers, and then they do their classes. And I've heard from users that once it gets, 2 to 3 levels down from the original expert, it's sort of watered down at that point.
Right.
So I'm definitely, keeping a personal connection, person-to-person consulting right now with my clients.
Okay.
And I have also recently partnered with a HR company. So that's another high-level thing is that I have another veteran entrepreneur who's building a virtual HR company.
Oh.
And most leaders, not most, but like a lot of times people will lump in, HR, culture, leadership, diversity and inclusion, and all of these connected but very different areas together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's a group of consultants that all decided, well, you're the HR expert. Like he's a 30-year HR guy. This other guy's the diversity and inclusion expert. I'm the, organizational behavior gal, and we can all come together. So that company is Cavness HR, and
Okay.
that is where small businesses can come to get HR needs, but then also sort of workshops, training packages on any of these areas that they might not have the money to bring in a big-time consultant, but
Right.
they can send all of their people to a 3-hour course, and we can start getting into some of these ideas and topics.
Well, I mean, that sounds fantastic. So one more time, Canvas, like an art canvas?
No, sorry, Cavness. So CAVNESS.
Cavness. Okay.
HR.com.
CavnessHR.com. Okay, I look forward to exploring that. I'm glad to hear that they're breaking it up, okay, because I do think that there are a lot of non-HR people that think of HR, and to your point, culture, inclusion, diversity, all of these things are just, they're under this one umbrella of HR, and they are under the umbrella of HR, but that doesn't mean that there's one person in the umbrella who's the expert in each, because each definitely has its own, oh my gosh, the impact of each is incredible. Actually, I read a study recently that demonstrated diversity alone, all things equal, diversity alone generally provides a double-digit increase in top-line revenues. Wow.
Oh yeah, I'd believe it.
I mean, all things
and
equal.
then also,
it's incredible.
Yeah, I could. Man, we mentioned briefly, the women on combat teams thing, but literally completely different point of view, right? If you think men versus women, opposite points of view, and that's pretty much what we found out on the battlefield was like, oh, we're all safer together,
Right.
So if you translate that to making more money, absolutely.
Right.
And then kind of what, going back to, again, earlier when we talked about experts versus kind of the CEO or the decision maker, one of the big problems with, that's HR's job is that, yes, you need the expert, right? You need the person that this is all they do. All I do, Carrie, is study culture and organizations. But the leader has to care about it too.
Oh gosh,
the leader
yes.
has to be the driver behind the policy,
right?
Because otherwise, it's just an HR thing. And then going to see HR feels like getting sent to the principal, then nobody wants to engage.
Right.
So
right.
It has to, no matter what, it has to come from the top, and the leader has to be the one going out and finding the right experts and bringing them in and really caring. Any leader can care, which is the great news.
Right.
And so, you can find the right expert, come up with the right strategy, and implement it. And it's all doable if the leader wants it to be.
Right. Wow. Well, Daniella, what a great conversation. I want to say thank you so much for your time coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
So I see that you have applied for some pretty big speaking opportunities. How's that going?
I have. So we'll see.
Is there a vote button?
No. I think this is an internal one, but I applied for, Daring Women Seattle, which is sort of a TED Talk kind of event.
Okay.
A huge deal out there. I did a TED Talk last year, and that was very intense, great, but intense. And yeah, I've got a couple more things coming up. So I just got hopefully my first paid essay as well, getting published soon. So
hey,
all of the public facing, so once it's paid, you're an author.
Once it's paid, you're an author. Okay.
So until you get paid to write something, you're a writer. And then once you get paid to write something, you're an author.
Well, I am an author. I did not know it, but now I need to go to my professional resume and add that I am an author.
Yep. As well you did. Good for you.
Oh, goodness. Well, listen, Daniella, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Let's absolutely stay in touch. Wish you the best of luck, and look forward to following your journey.
You too, Carrie. I am really enjoying this podcast, and I look forward to continuing as a listener.
Hey, thank you so absolutely much. Viewers and listeners, that was Daniella Young, CEO and Chief Consultant at Cultural Forte. What an interesting story. Go check her out. Until next time, thank you for listening to KMB Talk. You don't have to click home, but you can't stay here.